the Western Cape High Court has reserved judgment in the case by My Vote Counts, challenging the Electoral Matters Amendment Act. The lobby group wants the court to reinstate two key limits in the Political Party Funding Act that has been removed since the Electoral Matters Amendment Act came into effect. Political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng joins us now via video link to weigh in on this matter. Asanda, thank you so much for your time. So the two key limits that are in question here speak to, setting the disclosure threshold as well as the annual limit. My Vote Counts says that the act created a legal gap, a lacuna, and that it is unconstitutional and creates a political free-for-all opportunity. How important is this case being brought by My Vote Counts, also just given the lack of legal disclosure?
Well, I think this case is very important because, first of all, there were limits already in place of 15 million and the declaration was a minimum of 100,000. And when the president had to make changes which had to do with independent candidates, he then kind of sneaked in those changes which effectively removed the existing limits. And this is what is actually in dispute now, whether these limits should be brought back into play, or should, the president should be allowed to be the one who decides whether, what the limits are and whether they're going to be applied. It's important for people in South Africa to know who is funding what political party, because political party funding has been known in South Africa and in the world as something that can and has been used to basically present undue influence by those who have money. And so we do need to know who is funding what political party and to what extent they are funding it, because this has implications for the kinds of policies that we're going to see and the kinds of sponsorship of bills that we are going to see in South Africa and beyond.
And what does this, do for transparency, especially when you look at, financial disclosures by political parties? It's a long-standing issue, which is probably why the Electoral Matters Amendment Act is this controversial. But how important then is it, especially for the electorate, to hold political parties accountable if, for instance, they can't then have these financial fundings then, being in the open and also declared by political parties?
It's very important because in the past election that we've just had, for example, the second largest funded party, which got 35 million, ended up not even contesting the election. So that leads to questions of what happened to the money. Did it go back to the funder? Where some of it spent? And what exactly was done with that money? Because that was money that was received in the name of democracy, in the name of running for office. You also have the fact that the DA, for example, received about 65 million for just the period from January to March of the last period that was actually reported on. And that again it leads to questions of who is funding the Democratic Alliance and why are they funding it? We're also able to know from looking at these political party funding numbers that, for example, the African National Congress, which is the actual governing party, in the last election, actually was one of the most underfunded political parties. And this allows us to ask questions around why is the African National Congress underfunded? Is it a matter of funders don't believe in them, or they're scared of being kind of seen as corrupt because they are funding them? And then it leads us to the other question of why do the people who fund the DA but not fund the African National Congress? It also allows us to have conversations like right now, you've got the GNU, which includes the ANC and the DA. So did that money that was spent, that 65 million and more that was given to the DA, did it do its role? Is this what the funders wanted, that the DA would end up in government? And what are the implications for the DA being in government? Does it mean we're going to see policy changes because those with money and those with power are going to use their now influence within the political party as funders to push for policies that may or may not necessarily be in the interest of South Africans? And so it's very critical that South Africans know how much money is being spent by who, and also to be able to know what those people want. We've already seen, for instance, with Rise Mzansi and their funding that they got got from the Oppenheimers raised a lot of controversy, and there are quite a number of people who very openly stated that they liked the policies and the ideology of Rise Mzansi, but they wouldn't actually vote for Rise Mzansi because they were funded by the Oppenheimers, who themselves have a history of being the beneficiaries of apartheid mining, with its legacy of exploiting people and everything else in between. And so it's important for voters to know where the money that funds political party comes from, because it helps them to make decisions about who they're going to back and who they're going to vote for in a transparent way and in a way that can be clear to them, so that they're not kind of caught off guard when it's eventually revealed that actually the party you funded for had participated in your own oppression in one way or another, or had been a political party, a funder or a organization that, had you known, you would not have participated in giving them more power or in getting that undue influence behind the scenes on the political party that they would have funded.
So the Western Cape has obviously reserved judgment, and political parties, or at least the applicants, also have to then make their submissions, and the applicants listed here are the Presidency, Home Affairs, Justice and Correctional Services. Just given that, of course, the elections have come and gone, what are we likely to expect in terms of scenarios should the judgment come back and indeed find that this particular act is unconstitutional?
Well, I think, if the government does find that the act was unconstitutional, then that means the organization or any other civil society groups that are interested in this can go back to court to now demand a kind of record, a backdated record of who was funded by who and to what extent for this particular election. You must remember that one of the reasons why this political party funding is important is because you'll know, for instance, the African National Congress has in the past used its own kind of business company, which was Chatham House, to fund its own campaigns. And this itself has been something that's been controversial, and it's something that people have asked questions about. And so we need to know this information so that we know, as I've said, what people are backing when they vote for political parties and where the power of these political parties come from. Because it's not that people just, give money to political parties and then leave them be. More often than not, who funds is an indicator of who then has influence over the kind of policies that come from that political party and the policy direction of that political party, which has implications for ordinary citizens who don't have millions to fund in order to get their policies in place, but then can be used as voting fodder to rubber stamp the policies that those with money and those with power want to be in place.
Asanda, to what extent this will be a deal breaker in as far as the GNU is concerned, or is it a question of this is the kind of act that probably suits most political parties anyway?
I think this is the kind of act that suits most political parties because they don't necessarily want us to find out who funded them. And I think, in fact, the fact that there's a GNU works against South Africans because now you've got more political parties who are able to club together and push and use their power and their majority to push against this particular act and, its challenges should they come to Parliament. But I think this is something that, if the EFF, ATM, and MK coalition of opposition really wanted to kind of highlight the opposition party stance, this is something that they should be pushing ahead with and they should be taking to Parliament to be debated there. However, it's not likely to happen because they themselves, as the EFF, MK, and ATM, may not necessarily want you to know who funded them to be able to get the votes that they have. And so it's a case where, unfortunately, we are in some ways looking for almost self-governance and self-assessment where we're not going to get it. And this is why the courts are going to have to, on some level, get involved because the legislative framework that is available, aka Parliament, is not, it's not in the best interest of the people in Parliament to argue this one out. And that's why you go to the second layer of separation of powers, which is the judiciary. And I actually find it sad that, in the previous cases around this, one of the judges did agree with, the organization that brought the case, that they were right and that these limits needed to be there, but then didn't do the work of actually reinstituting them and said that they needed to be left to the legislative framework. I find that quite flawed, because what it does is it throws the ball back in the court of the very people that you are trying to hold accountable and you are trying to put checks in. This is very important for our separation of powers and our checks and balances on the executive and on those who hold power on the basis of the votes that we give them.
Asanda, thank you so much for that, and of course your time this afternoon. Asanda Ngoasheng, just unpacking that particular court case. Of course, the Western Cape High Court has reserved a judgment into this My Vote Count matters, challenging the Electoral Matters Amendment Act, of course, wanting the court to reinstate two key elements in the Political Party Funding Act.